I thank the gentlewoman from New Jersey for yielding and for hosting this special order and for granting me time to speak. Since the first nomination was announced by President-elect Trump's transition team, phones in my office have been ringing off the hook, and not a day goes by when I do not hear from my neighbors, friends, and constituents of their angst, frustration, and discontent. I share their anger and dread, that feeling of being punched in the gut as name after name has been released. Each nomination from President-elect Trump has put the fox in charge of the henhouse. We are not talking about simple differences in partisan ideology. We are talking about nominees who have devoted much of their professional lives to undermining the small d democratic institutions that are the foundation of our country. This new administration is so extreme that we cannot in any good faith give this president-elect the traditional deference to name a cabinet that represents his governing philosophy, because the appointments show it to be a philosophy that seeks to corrupt, if not fully destroy, our institutions, traditions, and values. Senator Jeff Sessions, the nominee for Attorney General, was considered too racist to serve on the federal bench by a Republican Senate, much less to head the Justice Department, and is someone who has so little respect for women's rights, he voted against the Violence Against Women Act and called Roe v. Wade a colossal mistake. Ben Carson, the nominee for HUD Secretary, said today in his confirmation hearing that he was against protecting LGBT Americans from housing discrimination because protecting them from housing discrimination would be granting them extra rights, refusing to recognize that LGBT Americans deserve equal rights. Tom Price, the nominee for HHS Secretary, wants to eliminate Medicare and Medicaid as we know them, repeal the Affordable Care Act without a second thought for the millions of Americans who would lose coverage or would be subject to limits on pre-existing conditions and would be subject to lifetime and annual limits. And there's so little understanding of women's health, he insisted that not a single woman would lose access to contraception if contraception coverage were eliminated. Betsy DeVos, the nominee for Education Secretary, advocated for years to move taxpayer dollars away from public schools and towards for-profit private schools that would leave behind low-income students, minority students, and children with disabilities. Scott Pruitt, the nominee for EPA Administrator, does not believe in climate change and is so linked to the fossil fuel industry that he has sued the EPA a dozen times to block environmental regulations designed to protect us from the effects of climate change. The list goes on and on, each more horrifying than the one before. These are not the values the majority of Americans voted for in November. And I don't just mean because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million. I cannot imagine that the voters who wanted to drain the swamp and voted for Mr. Trump for that purpose and have the needs of working people represented are thrilled to see him named the wealthiest cabinet with the greatest collection of Wall Street insiders in American history. The fact is, President-elect Trump and the Republican Party do not have any mandate from the people to carry out the dystopian horror show this cabinet represents. Rather than rubber stamping the most extreme cabinet I have seen in my 25 years in Washington, the Senate should reject these extreme nominees, and then both houses should do their constitutional duty to conduct oversight of the administration. I'm ready to do that work. Over a month ago, along with my Democratic Judiciary Committee colleagues, I sent a letter to Chairman Goodlatte asking him to hold hearings on the conflict of interest and ethics provisions that apply to the President of the United States. I have not heard a response. Every Democrat in the House signed on to the Protect Our Democracy Act, legislation to create an independent, bipartisan appointed commission to investigate Russian hacking in the 2016 election and to make recommendations to ensure that nothing like that happens again. It's interesting that not a single House Republican has joined us. I join my constituents and millions of Americans in wanting to know why. Why Republicans are working so hard to protect President-elect Trump from having to answer questions about Russian influence in this election. Why are Republicans working so hard to support President-elect Trump's extreme and out-of-touch cabinet? Why aren't Republicans asking the same questions about how President-elect Trump will avoid conflicts of interest? I have served in this body for nearly 25 years. I have seen this body take on the big questions of our time: the role of government in the lives of everyday Americans, the threat of the terrorism in the city I call home and around the country, the right of every American to marry whoever they love, the right of every American to vote free of intimidation, the right of every American to make their own health care choices. I have seen us come through those battles, bruised and battered, but stronger. That is why I refuse to despair. I refuse to put my head down and hide. I refuse to give up on America. I will stand here and fight for the country we all believe in. I will do everything in my power to represent the strong progressive values of the men and women who sent me here. I will work with my colleagues in the House and the Senate to stand united against any effort to undermine the rights we have fought so hard to achieve, whether it comes from the other end of the world or the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. But if there is to be any check on this administration, congressional Republicans will need to join in that fight. And it starts with rejecting this shameful slate of nominees. Thank you, and I yield back.